A virgin billionaire warns the poor maid he hired. I can't control myself. But this isn't about desire. It's about something much deeper and much darker. He lives alone in a cold mansion by the sea, haunted by guilt, chained to a promise he made years ago to never love again. She walks in with nothing but faith, cleaning floors while carrying a secret that could destroy them both. When her kindness begins to break through his walls, his warning starts to mean something terrifying, because his heart is waking up for the first time. Then one night, a voice from her past returns, threatening to expose everything, her lies, his pain, and the truth that could ruin them forever. Now the man who swore he'd never love must decide. Will he lock his heart away again, or lose control to something holy, something he's never dared to feel? What happens when purity meets temptation, and both discover that love might be the only thing worth losing control for? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The morning mist rolled gently across the Massachusetts coastline, wrapping the winding road to Stonehaven Estate in a soft, pearly embrace. Isabella Reyes gripped the handlebars of her borrowed bicycle, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs as she pedaled uphill. The old bike creaked beneath her, a steady companion on this journey that could change everything. At 32 years old, Isabella carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her circumstances. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, and her simple clothes were pressed despite their wear. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders. Her mother's medical bills, the tiny apartment they shared, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. This job at Stonehaven could be the answer to her prayers. The estate emerged from the mist like something from a dream. Iron gates opened onto manicured grounds that stretched as far as she could see. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of stone and glass, both beautiful and somehow lonely against the morning sky. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she chained her bicycle to a nearby rack, smoothing her skirt and touching the small cross at her neck for courage. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper. The older woman stood ramrod straight, her grey hair pulled back severely, her eyes sharp and assessing as they took in Isabella's appearance. "You're 3 minutes early," Mrs. Porter said, checking her watch. "Better than late. Come in." Isabella followed her into a foyer that could have housed her entire apartment. Her sensible shoes clicked softly on the marble floor as Mrs. Porter led her through the house, rattling off rules and expectations with military precision. "Mr. Stone requires absolute precision in everything," Mrs. Porter explained, her voice stern but not unkind. "The smallest mistake, the slightest deviation from his preferences, and he notices. He's not cruel, mind you, but he's particular. Very particular." Isabella nodded, taking mental notes. "I understand, Mrs. Porter. I'm detail-oriented and I learn quickly." Mrs. Porter's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "We'll see. The last 3 didn't last a week. Mind you, they didn't have your—" She paused, searching for the right word. Composure. They reached a study lined with books and windows overlooking the ocean. Mrs. Porter gestured for Isabella to sit in one of the leather chairs, then stood by the door, hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Stone will be here shortly. Remember, speak only when spoken to, maintain professional distance, and don't take his manner personally. He's—" She hesitated again. "Private." The door opened, and Gabriel Stone entered the room. Isabella rose immediately, her breath catching slightly. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair and features that might have been carved from marble. His suit was impeccable, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. Deep blue and intensely focused, yet somehow distant, as if he were looking at her through a veil of glass. "Miss Reyes," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He moved to stand behind his desk, keeping the furniture between them like a shield. "Your references are acceptable. You understand the position requires discretion?" Isabella nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze, despite the way it made her hands want to tremble. "Yes, Mr. Stone. Absolutely." He glanced down at her application, avoiding direct eye contact. "You'll be responsible for the East Wing, including my private quarters. Mrs. Porter will train you in the specific requirements. The salary we discussed over the phone is non-negotiable, but includes health benefits after 3 months." Health benefits. Isabella's heart leaped. Her mother's medications would be covered. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. I appreciate the opportunity." He looked up then, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Something flickered across his face. Discomfort? Interest? Before he quickly looked away. "Mrs. Porter will handle the paperwork. You can start tomorrow at 6 o'clock sharp." The interview was over as abruptly as it had begun. Gabriel Stone moved to the window, his back to the room, clearly dismissing them. Mrs. Porter ushered Isabella out, already discussing schedules and uniforms. But as they left, Isabella glanced back. Through the doorway, she saw Gabriel Stone still standing at the window, his reflection visible in the glass. He was watching her leave, his expression troubled and uncertain. In the hallway, Mrs. Porter pulled out a stack of forms. "I'll need these filled out before tomorrow. Emergency contacts, bank information for direct deposit, confidentiality agreements." Meanwhile, in his study, Gabriel Stone stood motionless by the window, watching as Isabella eventually emerged from the house and made her way to her bicycle. She moved with a grace that seemed at odds with her circumstances, her head held high despite the borrowed bike and worn clothes. "This is a mistake," he whispered to himself, his breath fogging the glass slightly. Everything about her, her quiet strength, her direct gaze, the gentle way she carried herself, unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. She was different from the others, and different was dangerous. Yet when Mrs. Porter returned with the approval form, he signed it without hesitation, his pen moving across the paper before he could change his mind. His hand was steady, but his heart wasn't, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something in motion that he couldn't control. Mrs. Porter picked up the signed form, a knowing look in her eyes that Gabriel steadfastly ignored. He returned to the window, watching as Isabella's figure disappeared down the winding drive, swallowed by the morning mist that still clung to the coastline. The house settled back into its usual silence. But something had changed. In the quiet of his study, Gabriel straightened his already straight tie, smoothed his already smooth jacket, and tried to convince himself that hiring Isabella Reyes was just another business decision. He wasn't entirely successful. The morning air bit sharp and cold as Isabella pushed her bicycle through the pre-dawn darkness. The massive iron gates of Stonehaven Estate loomed ahead, their elaborate scrollwork barely visible in the dim light. She checked her watch. 5:45 in the morning. Perfect timing for her first day. Mrs. Porter waited at the service entrance, her silver hair neat despite the early hour. "Good morning, Miss Reyes. Your uniform is in the staff changing room. I'll show you where to store your bicycle." The staff areas were warm and well organized, a stark contrast to the formal grandeur of the main house. Isabella changed quickly into the crisp black dress and white apron, smoothing her dark hair into a neat bun. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the apron strings. So much depended on this job going well. "First, we'll review the morning routine," Mrs. Porter said, leading Isabella through the silent halls. "Mr. Stone rises at 6:30 precisely. He takes his coffee in the kitchen at 6:45, black, no sugar, before retiring to his study until lunch." They passed beneath towering portraits that lined the main staircase. Stern faces stared down at them, a distinguished man with Gabriel's sharp jawline, and beside him a beautiful woman with familiar, deep blue eyes. Mr. Stone's parents, Mrs. Porter explained quietly. They passed away years ago, his father from heart failure, his mother in a car accident when Mr. Stone was in college. Isabella nodded, noting how the mother's eyes seemed to follow them, filled with a gentle sadness that her son had inherited. The house itself felt like a museum dedicated to loss, every surface pristine but somehow cold. Their tour paused at a set of ornate double doors. Unlike the rest of the immaculate house, a fine layer of dust coated the handles. Through the glass panels, Isabella could make out the shape of a grand piano, its polished surface gleaming faintly in the growing dawn light. "The music room," Mrs. Porter said softly. "It's to remain closed. Mr. Stone preserves it exactly as his mother left it." She hesitated, then added, "She was a concert pianist before her marriage. Taught Mr. Stone to play as well, though he hasn't touched the keys since her passing." They moved on, but Isabella couldn't shake the image of that silent piano, waiting in the dust like a monument to frozen grief. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, but clearly underutilized. Mrs. Porter demonstrated the coffee maker, a complicated machine that seemed to require an engineering degree to operate. "Mr. Stone is very particular about his coffee. The temperature must be exactly—" The sound of footsteps interrupted her explanation. Gabriel Stone himself appeared in the doorway, and Isabella's carefully rehearsed professional manner faltered slightly. He wore reading glasses that softened his severe features, and his dark hair was charmingly disheveled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it while reading. Without his usual suit jacket and tie, in just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he looked suddenly, startlingly human. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," Mrs. Porter said smoothly. "You're early today." He nodded distractedly, gaze flickering briefly to Isabella before focusing on the coffee maker. "Couldn't sleep. Please, don't let me interrupt the training." Isabella busied herself with the coffee preparation, acutely aware of his presence as he leaned against the counter, reading something on his tablet. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. When she placed the steaming cup before him, his fingers brushed hers accidentally. He jerked back as if burned, nearly spilling the coffee. "Thank you," he murmured, not meeting her eyes. "This is perfect." He retreated quickly, leaving Isabella staring after him, her skin tingling where they'd touched. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of instruction. Isabella learned the precise way Mr. Stone liked his shirts pressed, the exact arrangement of his desk supplies, the careful organization of his vast library. Everything in his world was ordered, controlled, precise, as if by maintaining perfect external order, he could somehow contain whatever chaos churned beneath his composed surface. She watched through windows as he paced in his study, observed his rigid schedule of meals taken alone, noted how he avoided mirrors and family photographs. The house felt less like a home and more like a self-imposed prison, with Gabriel Stone its solitary inmate. As evening approached, Isabella worked on polishing the silver in the formal dining room, a room she suspected rarely saw use. Without thinking, she began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had taught her. The familiar melody brought comfort as she worked, reminding her of Sunday mornings and her mother's warm embrace. She didn't hear the footsteps approach until they stopped abruptly behind her. The silence that followed was electric, charged with something she couldn't identify. "Please!" Gabriel's voice was raw, almost desperate. "Don't sing that! I can't control myself!" Isabella turned, startled by his tone. He stood frozen in the doorway, face pale, hands clenched at his sides. The harsh overhead lights cast shadows under his eyes, making him look haunted. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Stone." she stammered, setting down the silver carefully. "I didn't realize." But he was already gone, his rapid footsteps echoing down the hall. Later that night, after Isabella had left for home, Gabriel sat alone in the darkened parlor. His hands shook as he poured himself a glass of water, never alcohol, not anymore, and tried to steady his breathing. It wasn't desire that had overwhelmed him at the sound of that hymn. It was grief, raw and crushing, as fresh as the day he'd lost her. His mother had sung that very hymn every Sunday morning as she prepared for church, her voice floating through the house like a blessing. The last time he'd heard it was the morning of the accident, her voice carrying up the stairs as he'd rushed out without saying goodbye, too busy with his own concerns to spare her a moment. Now he sat in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, while somewhere in the city, Isabella Reyes returned to her own life, unaware of how deeply she'd pierced his carefully constructed walls with a simple song. The hymn echoed in his memory, a bittersweet reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he was afraid to feel again. The clock struck 10, its chimes reverberating through the empty house. Gabriel remained motionless in his chair, lost in memories of Sunday mornings and his mother's voice, until the last echoes faded into silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across Stonehaven's polished floors as Isabella arrived early, her heart still heavy from the previous evening's encounter. She moved quietly through her morning routine, hoping to delay any awkward interactions with her employer. The silver pieces she'd left unfinished needed attention, but she deliberately chose tasks in the opposite wing of the mansion. Her careful avoidance proved futile when she rounded a corner and nearly collided with Gabriel Stone himself. He stood in the hallway, looking more disheveled than usual, as if he'd been waiting. "Miss Reyes," he said softly, his voice rough with what might have been a sleepless night. "I've been hoping to speak with you." Isabella's hands twisted in her apron. "Mr. Stone, about last night." "Please," he interrupted, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Would you join me for tea?" The request surprised her. In the weeks she'd worked here, he'd never invited her to sit with him. She followed him to the bright kitchen, where morning light streamed through large windows overlooking the rocky coastline. Gabriel moved with uncertain grace, pulling out a chair for her before preparing tea himself, something she suspected he rarely did. His hands trembled slightly as he poured hot water into 2 delicate cups. "I owe you an apology," he said, settling across from her. "My reaction last night was extreme. You couldn't have known about the hymn." Isabella wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, drawing comfort from its heat. "There's no need to apologize, Mr. Stone." "There is." He stared into his tea as if searching for words. "That hymn, it was my mother's favorite. She sang it every Sunday morning while making breakfast. The last time I heard it was the day she died." The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. Isabella's heart ached at the pain evident in his voice. "How long ago?" she asked gently. 15 years. His fingers traced the rim of his cup. "I haven't heard it since then. When you started singing yesterday, it was like being transported back in time." "I'm so sorry for your loss," Isabella said softly. "My mother used to sing it too. It's why I know it." Something in Gabriel's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, perhaps. "Your mother. She's still living?" Isabella nodded. "Yes, though she's been ill. It's why I needed this job so badly." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the gentle clink of teacups and the distant sound of waves against the cliffs. To Isabella's surprise, Gabriel didn't rush to end their conversation. "I don't leave the house much," he offered unexpectedly. "People assume it's because I'm antisocial. But it's simpler here. I can work on my software designs without the world watching." Isabella remembered the gossip she'd heard about the reclusive billionaire of Stonehaven. "The media hasn't always been kind to you," she said carefully. A bitter smile crossed his face. "No, they haven't." He set down his cup with deliberate care. 5 years ago, a reporter tricked her way into an interview. She asked about my personal life, why I wasn't seen dating. When I explained my choices, my vow, she turned it into a mockery. "The virgin billionaire," Isabella whispered, immediately regretting saying it aloud. But Gabriel just nodded, his expression resigned. That's the one. It became quite the sensation. A man who chooses celibacy in today's world must be either lying or damaged, according to them. "There's nothing wrong with living by your convictions," Isabella said firmly. "The world could use more people who stand by their principles." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. "You're not curious. Most people can't resist asking why. Your reasons are your own, Mr. Stone. I respect that." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Miss Reyes. That's refreshing." Their conversation drifted to safer topics. The software company he ran from his home office, the gardens she'd been tending, the changing autumn weather. Isabella was surprised to find him knowledgeable about plants, though he admitted he rarely visited his own gardens anymore. Throughout the day, their interactions felt easier, less strained. Gabriel emerged from his study more frequently, asking her opinion on the placement of some books, commenting on the flowers she'd arranged. It was as if their morning conversation had cracked some invisible barrier. As evening approached, fog began rolling in from the ocean, wreathing Stonehaven in ethereal grey. Isabella was finishing up in the kitchen when she glanced out the window and saw a solitary figure moving through the mist toward the small family cemetery behind the house. Gabriel's dark form was barely visible through the fog as he knelt beside a grave marker. Even from a distance, the gesture was achingly intimate, a son visiting his mother. She watched as he laid a single white rose against the stone, his head bowed in what might have been prayer. Isabella found herself whispering her own prayer, her heart full of compassion for this complex man who carried so much pain beneath his carefully controlled exterior. "Dear Lord," she murmured, "please give him peace. Help him find his way back to joy." The fog continued to thicken, eventually obscuring Gabriel from view entirely. But Isabella stood at the window a moment longer, her prayer still echoing in her heart, hoping that somehow, somewhere, it would be answered. When she finally gathered her things to leave, the house felt different, less like a mansion frozen in time, and more like a home waiting to thaw. Perhaps today's conversations had been a first step toward that thaw, a small crack in the ice of years of solitude. The image of Gabriel at his mother's grave stayed with her as she made her way home through the misty evening, a reminder that behind every carefully constructed facade lies a heart capable of deep feeling, waiting for the courage to feel again. The autumn days at Stonehaven settled into a gentle rhythm, like waves lapping against the rocky shore below. Isabella found herself looking forward to the quiet mornings, when the house was still wrapped in dawn's soft embrace, and the kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and simple breakfast fare. Gabriel, who had once been a ghost in his own home, began appearing in the kitchen just as the coffee finished brewing. At first, their shared breakfasts were quiet affairs, comfortable silences punctuated by the clink of silverware and murmured thank yous. But gradually, like a flower slowly unfurling its petals, their conversations deepened. "My mother used to say that faith wasn't about having all the answers," Isabella said one morning, spreading butter on her toast. "It was about trusting even when the path ahead seems dark." Gabriel looked up from his scrambled eggs, his expression thoughtful. "I lost my faith when Sarah died," he admitted quietly, referring to his late fiancée. "It felt impossible to believe in a loving God after that. But you still visit the chapel sometimes," Isabella observed gently. "I've seen the candles." A small smile touched his lips. Old habits, perhaps, or maybe hope refuses to die completely. Their morning talks often turned to matters of the heart: loss, forgiveness, the weight of memory. Isabella shared stories of her mother's unwavering faith despite illness, while Gabriel spoke of his struggles with guilt and redemption. Each conversation was like a small bridge being built between their two worlds. One particularly stormy evening, as Isabella was finishing up her duties, the winds howled against the mansion's windows with unusual ferocity. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof like an army of impatient fingers. She was just about to head home when the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire house into darkness. "Miss Reyes?" Gabriel's voice called out from somewhere nearby. "Are you still here?" "Yes, Mr. Stone, I'm by the kitchen." "Please wait there. I have some emergency supplies in the library." Isabella made her way carefully through the darkened hallways, guided by the beam of her phone's flashlight. She found Gabriel in the library, methodically lighting candles of various sizes. The warm glow transformed the austere room into something almost magical, casting dancing shadows on the book-lined walls. "I always keep candles here," he explained, placing another one on the massive oak desk. "The power goes out frequently during storms." "It's beautiful," Isabella said softly, watching the flames flicker and dance. Gabriel paused in his task, studying her face in the candlelight. Would you like some coffee, since you can't drive home in this weather anyway?" The invitation surprised her, but she nodded. "That would be nice. I can help you make it. I have a French press in here, actually." He moved to a small cabinet and pulled out coffee-making supplies. "One of my few luxuries." They worked together in the candle-lit library, the storm raging outside, creating a cozy barrier between them and the rest of the world. The rich aroma of fresh coffee soon filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of beeswax candles. "This feels like something out of a novel," Isabella commented, accepting the steaming mug he offered. To her surprise, Gabriel chuckled, a warm, genuine sound she'd never heard before. "I suppose it does, though I doubt many novels feature a reclusive programmer and his housekeeper sharing midnight coffee." "You'd be surprised," she teased gently. "There's probably a whole genre." His smile reached his eyes for the first time since she'd known him, transforming his entire face. The usual tension in his features melted away, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. In that moment, he looked younger, unburdened. They talked about books they'd loved, childhood memories, simple things that somehow felt profound in the intimate candlelight. Gabriel revealed a dry sense of humor she'd never suspected, and Isabella found herself laughing more than she had in months. As she reached for the coffee pot to pour another cup, her hand accidentally brushed against his. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but Gabriel's reaction was immediate and intense. He jerked back as if burned, knocking over an empty mug. His breathing became ragged, and the walls seemed to slam back up behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice strained. "I told you I can't control myself when I feel too much." His hands were trembling as he backed away from the desk. "It's not safe. I'm not safe." "Gabriel," Isabella started, but he was already heading for the door. "Please, I need to be alone." He disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, and moments later she heard his study door slam shut and lock. Isabella sat in the library for a long time, surrounded by guttering candles and the remnants of their coffee. She couldn't understand how a man could be so pure of heart, yet torment himself so deeply over the simple human need for connection. His reaction seemed born not of lust, but of terror, fear of his own capacity for feeling. Sleep eluded her that night, even after the power returned and she made it home. Her thoughts kept returning to the moment his smile had reached his eyes, to the way he'd laughed so freely, and to the panic that had followed a simple touch. It was as if he punished himself for every moment of joy, every hint of human warmth. The next morning, she arrived early as usual, her mind still full of questions from the night before. But when she reached her cleaning cart, she stopped short. There, arranged simply but thoughtfully, was a small bouquet of daisies, not the cultivated kind from a florist, but wild ones that must have grown along the cliff-top path. A note was tucked among the flowers, written in Gabriel's precise handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that gentleness still exists." Isabella touched one of the soft white petals, her heart aching with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. In those simple flowers and few words, she saw both an apology and a confession, the longing of a soul that had forgotten how to accept the gentle things in life without fear. The autumn settled into a peaceful rhythm at Stonehaven Estate. Isabella found herself looking forward to the quiet mornings, when golden sunlight streamed through tall windows and cast long shadows across polished floors. Even Gabriel seemed more at ease, occasionally joining her for coffee or leaving books he thought she might enjoy on the kitchen counter. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Isabella hummed softly to herself as she folded fresh laundry in the sunny upstairs sitting room, taking care with Gabriel's precisely pressed shirts. The familiar work soothed her, and she found herself reflecting on how different her life had become in these past few weeks. The mansion no longer felt cold or imposing. It had become a sanctuary of sorts. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. The number wasn't saved in her contacts, but she recognized it instantly. Her hands began to shake as she answered. "Hello." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Hey, little sister." Rico's voice slithered through the phone, making her stomach clench. "Long time no talk. Miss your big brother." Isabella's throat went dry. She hadn't heard from him in 3 years, not since she'd finally gathered the courage to run away from his schemes. "Rico, why are you calling?" He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "What, I need a reason to check on my baby sister. Maybe I'm worried about you, working in that big fancy house all alone." Her heart stopped. "How do you know where I work?" "I know lots of things, Bella, like how your new boss is worth billions, and how you never told him about your past, about all the little favors you used to do for me." "Those weren't favors," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You forced me to help you steal. I never wanted any part of it." "Details, details." Rico's tone hardened. "Here's the thing. I'm in a bit of trouble. Need some cash to smooth things over. 20,000 should do it." Isabella nearly dropped the phone. "I don't have that kind of money." "No, but your boss does, and I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about your criminal history. How you helped me run those credit card scams, acted as lookout during break-ins." "I was 17. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "You threatened to hurt Mom if I didn't help you. You think anyone will care about the details? Once your precious Mr. Stone finds out you're from a family of criminals, you'll be back cleaning gas station bathrooms. Unless—" "Please," she begged, pacing the room in distress. "Please don't come here. Don't do this to me. I'll lose everything." "You have 1 week to get the money. I'll be in touch." The line went dead. Isabella pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to stifle her sobs. She hadn't heard footsteps approaching, but a sudden movement in the doorway made her spin around. Gabriel stood there, his face unreadable. How long had he been listening? His eyes were cold, distant, all the warmth of recent weeks vanished as if it had never existed. "Mr. Stone." She quickly wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Who were you talking to?" His voice was flat, controlled. "It was personal. A family matter." She tried to steady her breathing, to appear normal, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "A family matter." He repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them for lies. "One, that involves coming here? Losing everything?" Isabella's heart sank as she realized what fragments he must have heard, how suspicious they sounded without context. "Please, let me explain. No need." He cut her off, his posture rigid. "I think I understand perfectly well. I've dealt with people like you before." "People like me?" The words hit her like a physical blow. People who see an opportunity. A reclusive billionaire living alone. Easy target, right? His laugh was bitter, nothing like the warm chuckle she'd heard in the library that stormy night. "I suppose I should thank you for being careless enough to let me overhear your conversation." "That's not what this is." Isabella stepped toward him, desperate to make him understand, but he backed away as if her proximity might burn him. "I trusted you." The words came out barely above a whisper, heavy with something that sounded almost like grief. Then his expression hardened again. "That was my mistake. I won't make it twice." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing among the half-folded laundry, her world crumbling around her. She wanted to run after him, to explain everything about Rico, about her past, about how hard she'd worked to build an honest life. But the set of his shoulders, the cold dismissal in his voice, told her he wouldn't listen. The rest of the day passed in a blur of misery. Gabriel stayed locked in his study, and even Mrs. Porter seemed to eye her with new suspicion. Isabella went through her tasks mechanically, trying to hold back tears that threatened to fall at any moment. The next morning, she found her pay envelope in its usual spot, but it was noticeably thicker than normal. Inside was double her usual amount, along with a typed note that felt like ice in her hands. "Take the week off." It wasn't a request. The dismissal in those 5 words was clear as crystal. Isabella gathered her few personal belongings with trembling hands. She looked around the kitchen where she'd shared so many quiet moments with Gabriel, at the library where he'd finally laughed, at all the spaces where trust and something deeper had begun to grow. Now it was all poisoned by Rico's shadow and Gabriel's mistrust. As she walked down the long driveway for what felt like the last time, she allowed herself one glance back at the mansion. Movement caught her eye, Gabriel standing at his study window, watching her leave. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. She thought she saw something flicker across his face. Doubt, perhaps, or regret. But then he turned away, drawing the curtains closed. Inside his study, Gabriel pressed his forehead against the cool glass, convincing himself this was the right decision. He'd been foolish to let anyone get close, to think he could trust his judgment about people. Better to end it now, before she could hurt him worse. Better to be alone than vulnerable. But as he looked around his study, at the books they'd discussed, the coffee cup she'd brought him each morning, the small signs of warmth she'd brought to his isolated world, the mansion felt colder than it had in years. The silence that had once been his comfort now felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, threatening to suffocate him. He'd protected himself, yes, but as he stood in his empty study, surrounded by the artifacts of his solitary life, Gabriel couldn't shake the feeling that in trying to guard his heart, he might have just broken it instead. The tiny apartment felt even smaller after the grandeur of Stonehaven Estate. Isabella turned her key in the lock, shoulders heavy with defeat. The familiar smell of her mother's herbal tea mixed with medication greeted her as she stepped inside. "Mama, I'm home early today." Her mother's thin frame was curled up on their worn sofa, wrapped in the patchwork quilt Isabella had made her last Christmas. The television droned softly in the background, another rerun of her mother's favorite soap opera. "Isabella, what's wrong, mihija?" Her mother's eyes, though clouded with illness, still read her daughter like an open book. "You look like you've been crying." "It's nothing, Mama." Isabella tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Just some changes at work." She busied herself with straightening the pile of medical bills on the kitchen counter, each envelope marked with red, "past due" stamps that made her stomach clench. The latest one showed a balance that made her dizzy, $5,428. The doubled pay from Gabriel would help, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. That night, after settling her mother into bed, Isabella knelt beside her own narrow mattress. Her mother's rosary, worn smooth by years of prayers, felt cool against her fingers. Each bead brought a different prayer, for strength, for guidance, for her mother's health, and despite everything, for Gabriel. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "help him understand. Help him see the truth in my heart." Miles away, in his mansion by the sea, Gabriel Stone sat alone in his study. The computer screen cast a harsh glow across his face as he buried himself in lines of code. Work had always been his escape, his fortress against emotion. But tonight, the algorithms couldn't drown out the echoing silence of the house. His finger hovered over the keyboard, cursor blinking on the security system interface. He shouldn't do this. It was pathetic, desperate. Yet his hand moved of its own accord, pulling up the archived footage from 3 days ago. There she was, moving through the kitchen with quiet grace. The camera had no audio, but he could almost hear the soft hymn she always hummed while working. Not his mother's song, but something equally gentle, something that had begun to feel like home. Gabriel watched as she arranged fresh flowers in the window, straightened his reading glasses left carelessly on the counter, smiled at something Mrs. Porter said off-camera. Such simple moments, yet their absence left an ache he couldn't name. The clock on his screen showed 12 midnight. He'd been watching for over an hour. Disgusted with himself, he selected the footage and hit delete. The screen went black, reflecting his own haunted face. What kind of man was he, spying on memories like some lovesick teenager? He was protecting himself, protecting her. The conversation he'd overheard proved she had secrets, dangerous ones. But as days passed, doubt crept in like fog from the sea. He recalled her face when he'd confronted her, not guilty, but devastated. The way she'd tried to explain, voice breaking. Had he jumped to conclusions? Let old fears poison something pure? 6 more days crawled by. The mansion felt like a tomb. Mrs. Porter's disapproving looks grew harder to ignore. Even his beloved routines brought no comfort. Breakfast alone again, no gentle conversation to ease him into the day. No small kindnesses scattered like breadcrumbs through his solitary hours. On the 7th night, he cracked. "Mrs. Porter?" His voice sounded strange in the empty house. "Please call Miss Reyes. Tell her there are unfinished duties that require her attention." "Unfinished duties?" Mrs. Porter's tone was carefully neutral, but he caught the hint of satisfaction beneath it. "Very well, sir. I'll contact her first thing tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Gabriel paced his study, watching the driveway through gaps in the curtains. When Isabella's familiar figure appeared, walking this time, not cycling, his heart leaped traitorously in his chest. Their reunion in the kitchen was a masterpiece of awkward formality. She stood with perfect posture, hands clasped before her, eyes downcast. He gripped his coffee cup too tightly, speaking in clipped phrases about schedules and responsibilities. But beneath the stilted conversation, electricity crackled. Every accidental glance felt charged with unspoken words. When she moved past him to reach the coffee pot, he caught the faint scent of her soap. Simple and clean, like everything about her. His hands trembled so badly he had to set his cup down. "I trust you're... well?" he managed, hating how formal his voice sounded. "Yes, thank you." She paused, then added softly, "My mother's been ill, but we manage." The mention of her mother triggered something in his memory. Fragments of that overheard phone call taking on new meaning. Had he misunderstood everything? But before he could pursue the thought, Mrs. Porter entered with a list of tasks for the day, and the moment shattered like fine crystal. Isabella moved through her duties with the same care as always, but something was different. Her usual gentle humming was silent. Her shoulders held a new tension, and whenever their paths crossed, the air grew thick with things unsaid, apologies unspoken, explanations unheard, feelings buried beneath layers of propriety and fear. Gabriel watched her from doorways and around corners, telling himself he was merely supervising. But his eyes lingered on the graceful curve of her neck as she dusted, the gentle strength in her hands as she arranged flowers, the way sunlight caught in her dark hair and turned it to silk. He'd brought her back for unfinished duties, but standing there, watching her restore warmth to his cold house with each small act of care, he knew the truth. The only truly unfinished thing was the connection between them, fragile as a spider's web, yet strong enough to draw him out of isolation against his will. The question was, did he have the courage to rebuild what fear had broken? The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across Stonehaven's polished floors. Isabella was dusting the hallway portraits when she heard footsteps behind her. Gabriel stood there, a ring of old brass keys in his trembling hand. "Would you—" he cleared his throat. "Would you help me with something?" She nodded, setting aside her cleaning supplies. He led her down the east wing to a door she'd noticed before but never opened. The wood was darker than the others, with delicate carvings of musical notes around the frame. Gabriel's fingers shook as he fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism groaned with disuse, then clicked. He pushed the door open, releasing a wave of stale air and memories. Dust motes swirled like tiny stars in the sunbeams that pierced the heavy curtains. Isabella's breath caught at the sight before her. A magnificent grand piano dominated the center of the room, its black surface dulled by years of neglect. Sheet music lay scattered across the bench, yellowed with age. A child's practice book sat open, frozen in time. "This was my mother's sanctuary," Gabriel said softly. No one has been in here since she passed." Isabella moved carefully into the room, feeling like she was entering sacred space. Family photos lined the walls, a younger Gabriel at the piano, his mother's hands guiding his small fingers across the keys. Another showed him as a teenager, playing while a pretty girl with long blonde hair watched adoringly. "Would you like me to clean it?" she asked gently. He nodded, unable to speak. While she gathered her supplies, he stood in the doorway, watching as if afraid to cross the threshold. Isabella worked with reverent care, starting with the piano itself. She used soft cloths to lift years of dust from the gleaming wood, revealing the rich ebony beneath. The ivory keys emerged from their grey shroud, pristine as new fallen snow. As she worked, she could feel Gabriel's eyes following her movements. His breathing was uneven, as if each unveiled memory brought both pain and relief. "Would you play something?" she asked when she finished, gesturing to the freshly polished bench. He shook his head sharply. "I haven't touched it since. I can't." His hands were trembling worse now, and Isabella understood this room held more than just his mother's memory. Taking a deep breath, she sat at the piano herself. Her fingers found the opening notes of the hymn that had so affected him weeks ago. The piano's voice, though slightly out of tune from disuse, filled the room with warm, familiar tones. Gabriel made a choked sound, but instead of fleeing as she half expected, he took a hesitant step forward. Then another. His face showed confusion, as if his body was moving against his will. "I don't understand," he whispered. "It doesn't hurt like before. It's different." Isabella kept playing softly, watching as something shifted in his expression, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. He sank onto a nearby chair, his shoulders sagging. "I never told anyone why I made my vow." His voice was barely audible above the gentle music. Everyone assumed it was religious devotion, but it was punishment. Self-imposed exile. Isabella's fingers stilled on the keys, but the last notes seemed to hover in the air between them. "Her name was Sarah," he continued, staring at something only he could see. "We were engaged right after high school. So young, so sure we had everything figured out." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I was showing off that night, driving too fast on wet roads. She was laughing, telling me to slow down." His voice broke. Isabella waited, her heart aching for the boy he'd been, the man he'd become. The crash happened so fast. One moment she was there, the next, gone, just gone. He pressed his palms against his eyes. "I walked away without a scratch. Tell me how that's fair. How could God let that happen?" "Oh, Gabriel," Isabella whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I made my vow that night, in the hospital chapel. No more love, no more desire, no more risk of hurting anyone else that way. I threw myself into work, built this empire from nothing, but it was all just penance." Isabella moved from the piano bench to kneel beside his chair. She didn't touch him, but her presence seemed to steady him. "I believed God was punishing me through her death," he continued, "that I didn't deserve happiness or closeness ever again." Isabella's heart ached at the pain in his voice, at the years of self-imposed isolation. When she spoke, her words were soft but firm. "Maybe he wasn't punishing you at all, Gabriel. Maybe—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe he was saving your heart for a different kind of love, one that could heal instead of hurt." Gabriel's head snapped up. His eyes met hers, and the look in them made her breath catch, like a man seeing sunlight after years in darkness. His lips parted, but no words came out. The silence between them hummed with possibility. In that moment, the dusty piano room seemed to hold its breath. The afternoon sun painted everything in gold, and Isabella could almost feel the presence of those who had loved him. His mother, Sarah, even, God himself, all wanting him to find his way back to life, to love, to hope. The tenderness in Isabella's eyes held no pity, only understanding. And for the first time in 15 years, Gabriel Stone felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble. Dark clouds loomed over Stonehaven Estate like a heavy blanket, casting long shadows across the kitchen where Isabella worked. She hummed softly while preparing a simple chicken casserole, trying to ignore the growing storm outside. The wind howled against the windows, making them rattle in their frames. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Isabella crossed herself, an old habit from childhood. The kitchen was her sanctuary, filled with the warm scents of herbs and roasting vegetables. She'd learned early that good food could heal both body and spirit, and lately she'd noticed Gabriel eating more regularly, color returning to his pale cheeks. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the kitchen in harsh white flashes. The old wiring in the mansion groaned under the strain of the storm. Isabella frowned at the lights as they flickered, then steadied. "Just hold on until supper's done," she murmured to the ancient electrical system, sliding the casserole into the oven. As she straightened, another crack of thunder shook the house, closer this time, making her jump. The lights dimmed again, and suddenly she heard an ominous pop from inside the oven. Sparks flew from the control panel, and before she could react, flames erupted around the edges of the oven door. Isabella stumbled backward, her heart pounding. "Oh God, please, no!" The fire spread quickly, feeding on accumulated grease in the old appliance. Smoke began to fill the kitchen, thick and acrid. She coughed, searching frantically for the fire extinguisher, but panic made her movements clumsy. "Isabella!" Gabriel's voice cut through the chaos. She turned to see him in the doorway, his eyes wide with terror. In 3 long strides, he reached her. Without hesitation, he stripped off his wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "We need to get out, now." "But the fire," she protested, choking on the smoke. "Damn the fire!" His voice was raw with fear as he pulled her towards the door. "You're what matters." The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to see. Isabella felt Gabriel's arm around her waist, guiding her through the haze. She heard him grunt in pain, but couldn't see what happened. They burst out onto the back patio, gulping in the clean, rain-swept air. Thunder crashed overhead, and fat raindrops pelted them. But neither noticed. They were alive. They were safe. "Are you hurt?" Gabriel demanded, his hands frantically checking her for injuries. "Isabella, tell me you're not hurt." "I'm fine," she assured him, still catching her breath. "Just scared, that's all. But your hand—" Gabriel looked down as if just noticing the angry red burn across his palm where he'd grabbed the hot oven handle to make sure it was shut. The skin was already beginning to blister. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice was tight with pain. "It is not nothing." Isabella's voice took on the firm tone she usually reserved for her younger cousins. "Inside, now, you need first aid." She led him to the downstairs bathroom, where she kept a well-stocked medical kit. The power was out now, but emergency lights cast a soft glow through the halls. They could hear rain drumming on the roof and distant sirens. Someone must have called the fire department. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to the closed toilet lid. Gabriel complied without argument, watching as she efficiently gathered supplies. Isabella ran cool water over his burned hand first, her touch gentle but sure. Gabriel's breath hitched, whether from pain or her nearness, she wasn't certain. "You shouldn't have risked yourself," she murmured as she carefully dried the burn. "Running into a burning room like that. I heard the smoke alarm and knew you were in there." His voice was rough. I can't lose anyone else. Not like that. Not you." Isabella's hand stilled for a moment as she processed his words. Then she continued working, applying burn cream with delicate touches. "Still," she said softly, "you got hurt because of me." "No." The word was fierce. "I got hurt because I was careless. You've never hurt me, Isabella. Just the opposite." She looked up then, and found his face inches from hers. In the dim light, his eyes were dark pools of emotion she'd never seen him display before. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Gabriel's uninjured hand came up to hover near her cheek, not quite touching. "You think I hired you to clean my house?" he said, his voice breaking. "But you've been cleaning my soul." The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Isabella felt tears spring to her eyes. All these years, he continued, I've been living in darkness, punishment, isolation. Then you came with your quiet faith, your gentle hands, your light. You made me remember what it feels like to be human. Gabriel, she breathed, her hand still cradling his injured one. Something crumbled in his expression then, the last wall, the final defense. With a sound like a sob, he leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. Isabella's free hand came up to cup the back of his neck, steadying him. They stayed that way for several heartbeats, simply breathing together. There was nothing sinful in the embrace. Instead, it felt sacred, like a prayer answered after years of silence. Two souls recognizing each other at last. Gabriel's shoulders shook as years of pent-up emotion poured out of him. Isabella held him through it, murmuring soft words of comfort in Spanish like her mother used to do for her. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in the dim bathroom, they had found shelter in each other's presence. The moment stretched on, pure and precious, as if God himself had carved out this space for healing. When Gabriel finally pulled back slightly, his eyes were wet but clear. Isabella finished bandaging his hand with tender care, her touch a benediction. "Thank you," he whispered, and she knew he meant for more than just the first aid. A commotion outside announced the arrival of the fire trucks. Reality began seeping back in, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They had seen each other, truly seen each other, and nothing would ever be quite the same. The morning dawned clear and bright, washing away the chaos from the previous night's fire. Repair crews had already arrived, their trucks lining the curved driveway of Stonehaven Estate. The kitchen itself was mostly smoke-damaged rather than burned, thanks to the quick response of the fire department. Isabella stood at the temporary cooking station they'd set up in the dining room, flipping pancakes on an electric griddle. The familiar routine helped settle her nerves after the previous night's intensity. She hummed softly, remembering the way Gabriel had held her, the way his walls had finally crumbled. "Something smells wonderful." Gabriel's voice came from behind her, making her smile. He stood in the doorway, his injured hand carefully bandaged, wearing a light blue sweater that made his eyes seem brighter than usual. "Just plain pancakes?" Isabella replied, sliding a stack onto a plate. "But I found some fresh berries in the refrigerator that survived." "Plain pancakes made by you are better than fancy ones made by anyone else," Gabriel said, settling into his chair. His voice held a new warmth that made Isabella's heart flutter. Mrs. Porter bustled in with fresh coffee, raising an eyebrow at their easy manner, but saying nothing. She'd noticed the change in Gabriel since Isabella's arrival. How could she not? The house itself seemed lighter somehow. They ate together, sharing quiet conversation and occasional laughter. Gabriel told stories about his early days of programming, including a particularly funny incident involving a coding error that had turned all his test computer's screens hot pink. "I couldn't fix it for 3 days," he admitted, chuckling. "Every investor who came to see the prototype thought I was trying to market to teenage girls." Isabella's laugh filled the room like sunshine. Maybe that would have been a better market strategy. "Perhaps." Gabriel smiled, his eyes lingering on her face. "Sometimes the best things in life come from our mistakes." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken meaning. Mrs. Porter cleared her throat pointedly, making them both jump slightly. "The contractors need your approval on the ventilation system, Mr. Stone," she reminded him. "Of course." Gabriel stood reluctantly. "I'll be in my study after, Isabella. Perhaps we could have tea later." Isabella nodded, her cheeks warm. "I'd like that." The morning passed in a peaceful blur as Isabella went about her duties, working around the repair crew. Everything felt different after last night. Lighter, more hopeful. Even the old house seemed to have shed some of its ghosts. But peace, as Isabella knew too well, was often fragile. The first indication of trouble came just after lunch. Her phone buzzed with a series of increasingly angry text messages from Rico. She'd been ignoring his calls for days, hoping he'd give up, but her brother had never been one to take rejection well. Isabella's hands shook as she read the final message. "If you won't answer me, I'm coming there. Hope your rich boss likes publicity." Before she could respond, the security system chimed. On the mounted screen in the hallway, she could see Rico at the front gates, pacing like a caged animal. Her heart stopped. Isabella rushed outside, praying she could handle this before anyone noticed. The gravel crunched under her feet as she hurried down the long driveway. "Rico, please," she begged as she approached the gate. "You can't be here!" Her brother's face was twisted with anger. He held up his phone, snapping photos through the iron bars. "Can't be here? What, am I embarrassing you in front of your fancy new friends?" "It's not like that," Isabella said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "This is my workplace. You can't just show up." "Then answer my calls." Rico snarled. "You owe me, Isabella. After everything I did for you growing up." "You mean after everything you made me do?" Isabella's voice cracked. "The schemes, the lies, the stolen money. I left that life behind, Rico. I'm not going back." Rico's laugh was ugly. "You think you're better than me now, working as a maid for some rich freak? I wonder what the tabloids would pay for these photos. Virgin Billionaire's secret maid, criminal past revealed." "Stop it," Isabella pleaded. "Rico, please. Mama needs the money from this job. Her treatments should have thought of that before you got high and mighty." Rico sneered, backing away. "You've got 24 hours to get me what I want, or these photos go to every gossip site in Boston." Isabella stood at the gates long after Rico had gone, tears streaming down her face. When she finally turned back toward the house, her heart nearly stopped. Gabriel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of dread. Gabriel disappeared into his study, and even Mrs. Porter seemed cooler than usual. Isabella tried to focus on her work, but her hands trembled as she folded laundry, cleaned windows, anything to keep busy. The storm broke at sunset. "My study, now." Gabriel's voice over the house intercom was arctic. Isabella's legs felt like lead as she climbed the stairs. Mrs. Porter was already there, standing like a stern sentinel near the window. Gabriel sat behind his massive desk, security footage playing on multiple screens behind him. "Explain." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his voice devoid of all the warmth from breakfast. "Gabriel, please, I can—" "Mr. Stone," he corrected coldly. "I saw everything on the cameras, the photos, the threats, the talk of your criminal past. Was any of it real, Isabella? Or was this all an elaborate con?" "No," Isabella cried. "It's not what you think. Rico, my brother, he—" "Your brother?" Gabriel cut her off, finally meeting her eyes. The betrayal there made her flinch. "The one you claimed was dead to you? The one you said you hadn't spoken to in years? More lies." "I never lied about who I am," Isabella whispered. "Everything between us was real." "Real." Gabriel stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "Was it real when you kept taking his calls? Real when you hid your past? Real when you played on my sympathies, made me think you understood pain, understood faith?" "Mr. Stone." Mrs. Porter interjected softly, but Gabriel wasn't finished. "I was a fool," he said, his voice shaking. "A fool to think you were different, to think anyone could be trusted. You're fired, Miss Reyes. Collect your things and leave. Now." Isabella stood frozen, her world crumbling. "Gabriel, please listen. Get out." Each word was like ice. Mrs. Porter took her arm gently, leading her to the door. Outside, thunder rolled, another storm approaching. How fitting. Isabella packed her small bag mechanically, tears falling freely now. The pain wasn't from losing the job, though God knew she needed it. No, this pain came from watching trust die in Gabriel's eyes, from losing the connection they'd built so carefully, from having a heart understood and then rejected in the span of a single day. She left her keys on the kitchen counter, next to the pancake griddle still out from their laughing breakfast. Had that really been only hours ago? The rain was starting as she stepped outside, but Isabella barely felt it. She began the long walk down the driveway, each step taking her further from the man who had made her believe in goodness again. Behind her, through the study window, Gabriel watched her go. His hand pressed against the glass, the bandage Isabella had so carefully applied, now wet with rain that leaked through unseen cracks. He told himself this was for the best, that he was protecting himself, that trust only led to pain. But as Isabella's figure disappeared into the storm, even Gabriel couldn't convince himself that this pain was better than the warmth of trusting her had been. The autumn wind whistled through Stonehaven's empty halls. Gabriel sat in his study, surrounded by multiple computer screens, their blue light casting harsh shadows across his face. Lines of code scrolled endlessly, but he barely saw them. His fingers moved mechanically across the keyboard, muscle memory doing what his distracted mind could not. 3 weeks had passed since that stormy night. 3 weeks of silence, of emptiness, of questioning every moment they'd shared. The mansion felt like a tomb again, just as it had before Isabella arrived with her gentle hymns and warm presence. "Sir?" Mrs. Porter's voice broke through his thoughts. "It's past midnight. You haven't eaten since breakfast." Gabriel didn't look up. "I'm fine." "You haven't been fine for weeks," she said, setting down a cup of tea. "And that's the $4 million donation you've made this month." His fingers paused over the keyboard. "The Children's Hospital needed a new wing. And last week it was the homeless shelter. The week before that, the women's refuge." Mrs. Porter's voice softened. "Money won't fill the void she left, Mr. Stone." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "This has nothing to do with Miss Reyes. I'm simply being a responsible citizen." "Of course, sir." Mrs. Porter's tone made it clear she didn't believe him. "Will you at least try to sleep tonight?" Sleep. The word made him shudder. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant hearing Isabella's voice singing that hymn, seeing her face in the candlelight during that storm, feeling the gentle touch of her hands as she bandaged his burns. He'd wake up reaching for her, her name on his lips, only to find cold sheets and crushing loneliness. "I have work to do," he said flatly. After Mrs. Porter left, Gabriel opened his private browser. His fingers moved without conscious thought, typing Isabella Reyes Boston into the search bar. He'd done this countless times over the past weeks, always deleting his history afterward, ashamed of his weakness. A new article caught his eye. Local church mourns passing of beloved parishioner. His heart stopped when he saw the photograph. An elderly woman with Isabella's same kind eyes, taken at what appeared to be a church gathering. Maria Reyes, age 68, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Isabella's mother. The reason she'd needed this job so desperately. The woman whose medical bills had driven her to seek work at Stonehaven. Gabriel's hands shook as he read further. The funeral had been small, private. The article mentioned the deceased was survived by her daughter, Isabella, whose dedication to her mother's care was an inspiration to the entire congregation. No mention of a brother, no hint of the criminal past Rico had threatened to expose, just a daughter who had sacrificed everything to care for her dying mother. Shame washed over Gabriel like a wave. He'd been so quick to assume the worst, to let his past traumas cloud his judgment. He opened his banking software and stared at the screen for a long moment before making a decision. Isabella sat in the tiny kitchen of her apartment, surrounded by sympathy cards and wilting flowers. The chair where her mother used to sit stood empty, a half-finished crossword puzzle still on the table beside it. The silence was deafening. "Mija," her mother had said that final evening, her voice barely a whisper. "You carry too much weight. The pain from your brother, the shame that isn't yours to bear, and now this sadness about your Gabriel." "He's not my Gabriel, Mama," Isabella had replied, adjusting the oxygen tube with gentle hands. "He is the first man who saw your heart, truly," Maria had said, "and you saw his. That makes him yours, whether either of you accepts it or not." She'd gripped Isabella's hand with surprising strength. "Child, forgiveness is your freedom. Without it, you'll carry these chains forever." Those were among her last words. She'd fallen asleep holding Isabella's hand and simply never woken up. The doctors said it was peaceful, painless, a gentle passing. But for Isabella, it felt as though the last anchor holding her to the world had been cut loose. The funeral was small but filled with love. Her mother's church friends brought food, sang hymns, shared memories. Isabella moved through it all in a fog, accepting hugs and condolences with automatic politeness. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see a tall figure with piercing eyes and a hesitant smile. But Gabriel never came. Why would he? She hadn't told him about her mother's declining health, hadn't explained about Rico's threats being tied to old family debts and his illegal schemes. She'd kept so much hidden, trying to protect her job, her mother, her heart. In the end, she'd lost everything anyway. A week after the funeral, an envelope arrived from the hospital. Isabella's hands trembled as she opened it, expecting another bill she couldn't pay. Instead, she found a letter stating that all outstanding medical expenses had been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. She sank into her mother's chair, the paper crumpling in her grip. Only one person had the means and the knowledge to do this. Gabriel. Even after everything, even believing the worst of her, he'd still tried to help. From a safe distance, hidden behind anonymity. The gesture brought fresh tears to her eyes. It was so perfectly him, generous yet removed, compassionate yet afraid to show it directly. She wanted to thank him, to explain everything, to hear his voice just once more. But what would be the point? He'd made his feelings clear that stormy night. She had to respect his decision, even if it felt like her heart was being torn in two all over again. Isabella pulled out her mother's old Bible, its pages worn soft with use. A pressed flower fell from between the pages. A daisy, like the ones Gabriel had left on her cleaning cart that morning after the power outage. She touched its dried petals gently, remembering his note. "Thank you for reminding me that gentleness still exists." "Oh, Mama," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "You were right about forgiveness. But how do I forgive myself for not being braver? For not telling him everything from the start?" The silence held no answers. Outside, rain began to fall, a gentle autumn shower, nothing like the storm that had changed everything at Stonehaven. Isabella closed the Bible, carefully replacing the daisy. She had to believe her mother's words about freedom through forgiveness. It was all she had left to hold on to. Back at Stonehaven, Gabriel paced his study like a caged animal. The donation to the hospital had been traced and processed successfully. Isabella would have received notification by now. He imagined her opening the letter, those expressive eyes filling with understanding. Would she see it as manipulation, as an attempt to buy forgiveness? Or would she understand it for what it was? The only way he knew how to help. The only language of care he truly understood. Mrs. Porter appeared at the door. "Sir, your dinner is getting cold." "I'm not hungry." "You haven't been hungry for weeks," she observed. "Just as you haven't played the piano since she left, haven't smiled since that morning, haven't—" "That's enough!" Gabriel snapped. Then softer. "Please, just leave me be." But as the housekeeper turned to go, Gabriel spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong, wasn't I?" Mrs. Porter paused. "About Miss Reyes?" "Yes, sir. Grievously wrong. Her mother died." The words hung heavy in the air. She was alone for that. Because of me. It's not too late to make it right. Gabriel shook his head. Some bridges can't be rebuilt once burned. Perhaps, Mrs. Porter said carefully. But some fires purify rather than destroy. They burn away pride and fear, leaving only what's true. She closed the door softly, leaving Gabriel to his thoughts. He moved to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, Isabella was grieving alone in her tiny apartment. The woman who had brought light back into his dark world was suffering, and he had put pride and fear above truth and love. His mother's hymn echoed in his memory, but for the first time since Isabella's departure, it didn't bring pain. Instead, it carried his mother's voice from long ago. Love isn't about being worthy, Gabriel. It's about being brave enough to try. He whispered Isabella's name into the darkness, a prayer and a confession all at once. But redemption, as his father used to say, required more than whispered words in empty rooms. It required action, courage, truth. The question was, would he find that courage in time? The autumn wind whipped around Gabriel as he walked down Main Street, his first visit to town in what felt like forever. The familiar anxiety tightened his chest. Too many people, too much noise, too many memories. But he forced himself forward, one step at a time. He needed printer ink, and for once he couldn't bring himself to send Mrs. Porter. "Mr. Stone, Gabriel Stone." Gabriel tensed at the voice, turning to find Marcus Chen, a local journalist he'd spoken with years ago. The man's friendly smile did little to ease Gabriel's discomfort. "I almost didn't recognize you outside Stonehaven," Marcus said, falling into step beside him. "Actually, I've been meaning to contact you about a story I'm working on. It's about that extortion ring they broke up last month, the one Rico Reyes was involved in." Gabriel stopped, walking. Rico Reyes. Yes, nasty business. He was arrested trying to blackmail several wealthy individuals with doctored photographs. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through news articles. He even tried targeting you, apparently. The police found fake photos on his computer, manufactured evidence of corporate espionage. He was planning to use them to extort money from you. The world tilted sideways. Gabriel grabbed the nearest lamppost for support, his knees weak. When was this? The arrest. 3 weeks ago, but they found evidence dating back months. He had quite the operation going, using inside connections to gain access to his targets. In your case, he tried to use his sister, but she wouldn't. His sister? Gabriel's voice cracked. Marcus nodded, still scrolling through his notes. Isabella Reyes. She worked as your housekeeper, right? The police report says she refused to help him. That's actually what led to his arrest. She finally reported him to the authorities after years of his harassment. Gabriel couldn't breathe. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The phone call he'd overheard, Isabella's pleading, her tears when he'd accused her. He'd been so wrong, so terribly, unforgivably wrong. "Mr. Stone, are you all right? You look pale." "I have to go," Gabriel managed, already turning away. "Thank you for telling me." He practically ran back to his car, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. The drive back to Stonehaven passed in a blur. He burst into his study, frantically pulling open drawers until he found it. Isabella's resignation letter, crumpled and tear-stained. Her handwriting trembled across the page. "Dear Mr. Stone, I understand your decision to terminate my employment. I wish I could have found the courage to tell you everything sooner, but fear and shame held me prisoner. My brother's actions are not my own, yet I accept that keeping his threats secret has cost me your trust. You opened your home to me, shared your pain, your music, your faith. In return, I gave you doubt. For that, I am truly sorry. Please forgive me for whatever you thought I was. I pray you find someone worthy of the gentle soul you hide from the world. With deepest regret, Isabella Reyes." Gabriel sank into his chair, the letter falling from his numb fingers. All this time, she'd been protecting him. While he'd been hiding in his mansion, nursing his wounded pride, she'd been gathering the courage to stand up to her brother, to do what was right, alone. The memory of her face that last night haunted him. The hurt in her eyes when he'd accused her of conspiring against him. The way she'd reached out, trying to explain, and he'd turned away. Pride and fear had blinded him to the truth in her heart. He thought of her mother's funeral. Had she stood there alone, grieving, while he wallowed in self-righteous anger? The weight of his mistakes crushed him. He'd failed, her in every way possible. Dawn found him still in his study, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of hope he didn't deserve. But with the light came clarity. He couldn't let another day pass without trying to make this right. He changed his clothes, ignored his racing heart, and headed for the garage. Mrs. Porter appeared, startled to see him dressed for town so early. "Sir, is everything all right?" "No," he answered honestly. "But I'm finally going to try to fix it." "You're going to find her." Mrs. Porter's face softened with understanding. Gabriel nodded, getting into his car. "I have to. I owe her the truth. And an apology that's years overdue. It's about time." Mrs. Porter smiled. "Godspeed, Mr. Stone." The drive into the city was his first in years, each mile a battle against his instinct to retreat. But Isabella's words from the letter echoed in his mind. "Please forgive me for whatever you thought I was." No, it was he who needed forgiveness, he who had failed to see the truth of her heart. Traffic thickened as he entered the city proper. His hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. But he pressed on, navigating through streets he barely remembered, following the address he'd memorized from her employee file. "Please," he whispered, a prayer to whatever angels might be listening. "Please let me find her. Let me make this right." The morning sun climbed higher, blessing his journey with golden light as Gabriel Stone, the reclusive billionaire, the man who hadn't left his estate in years, drove deeper into the city, chasing the only thing that mattered anymore, the chance to heal what his fear had broken. The city streets buzzed with morning activity as Gabriel parked his car near a small coffee shop. His hands trembled as he approached the counter, unused to such public spaces after years of isolation. "Excuse me," he asked the barista, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm looking for Isabella Reyes. She used to work at Stonehaven Estate." The young woman's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh, Miss Reyes? Sweet lady. She volunteers at Grace House now, just 3 blocks down." She pointed east. Big brick building with blue trim. Can't miss it. "Thank you," Gabriel whispered, leaving a $100 bill in the tip jar. The walk to Grace House felt endless. Each step brought memories flooding back. Isabella's gentle humming in the kitchen, her fingers touching the piano keys, the way she'd looked at him with such compassion despite his coldness. Grace House stood solid and welcoming, its weathered brick facade sporting a fresh coat of paint. A hand-painted sign read, "Welcome, sisters," above the door. Gabriel's courage nearly failed him at the threshold. But then he heard it. Her voice, soft and clear, floating through an open window. "That's right, sweetheart. Take your time with the words. God's message isn't meant to be rushed." Following the sound, Gabriel found himself in a modest library. Isabella sat at a small table, helping a young girl sound out verses from a worn Bible. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, and she wore a plain blue dress instead of her former maid's uniform. But her grace, her essential Isabella-ness, took his breath away. Other women occupied the room, some reading, others talking quietly. They looked up as he entered, tension immediately filling the space. Several of them exchanged knowing glances. They recognized a man struggling with his demons when they saw one. Isabella felt the shift in the room's energy before she saw him. When she lifted her eyes and found Gabriel standing there, time seemed to stop. The book slipped from her fingers. "Keep reading, Sarah," she managed to say to the young girl. "I'll be right back." The other women began gathering their things, an unspoken understanding passing between them. One by one they filed out, some touching Isabella's shoulder supportively as they passed. Soon, only Gabriel and Isabella remained, the weight of months of silence hanging between them. Gabriel's carefully prepared speech disappeared. His legs felt weak. Without conscious thought, he found himself dropping to one knee before her, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Isabella," he choked out. "I was wrong. So terribly wrong, about everything." She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Stone, please," he interrupted. "I know about Rico, about what he tried to do, about how you stood up to him, reported him. While I was hiding in my mansion, judging you, you were being braver than I've ever been." Isabella's composure wavered. "You didn't know. How could you have known when I didn't tell you? But I should have trusted you." Gabriel's voice cracked. "Should have seen the truth in your heart, instead of letting my fears poison everything good between us." He reached for her hand but stopped himself, remembering all the times he'd pulled away from her touch. "I've spent years building walls, convinced that control was the same thing as virtue. But I was wrong about that too." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't control myself anymore." Gabriel's words tumbled out, raw and honest. "Not from loving you. And I don't want to try. You walked into my house to clean it, but you ended up cleaning my soul instead. You showed me what real faith looks like. Not perfect control, but perfect trust." A tear slipped down Isabella's cheek. "Gabrielle, I don't deserve your forgiveness." He continued. "I know that, but I had to tell you the truth. Had to let you know that you changed me. That meeting you was the greatest gift God ever gave me, and I threw it away because I was too afraid to believe in miracles." Isabella's hand touched his cheek, wiping away his tears. The simple gesture nearly undid him completely. "I forgive you," she whispered. "How?" he asked brokenly. "How can you?" "Because forgiveness isn't about deserving," she said softly. "It's about mercy, and I learned mercy through pain, through watching my mother forgive until her last breath, through learning to forgive myself." Gabriel pressed his forehead against her hand, overwhelmed by her grace. "Please," he whispered, "please give me a chance to know you again, to do better this time." Isabella gently pulled her hand away, and for a moment Gabriel's heart stopped. But then she smiled, that same smile that had first begun melting his frozen heart months ago. "I would like that," she said, "but not as your maid, as your equal." Gabriel stood slowly, hope blooming in his chest for the first time in years. I wouldn't want it any other way. Through the window, sunlight streamed in, warming the space between them. The distance wasn't gone. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But in that moment, surrounded by books of faith and forgiveness, they had taken the first step towards something new, something real, something neither control nor fear could touch. Isabella looked around the library, at the safe haven she'd helped create for women learning to trust again. "I need to finish Sarah's lesson," she said softly. Gabriel nodded, understanding. May I call on you tomorrow?" "Yes," she smiled. "I'd like that very much." He turned to go, then paused. "The hymn," he said quietly. "The one your mother taught you. Would you teach it to me someday?" Isabella's eyes shone with tears and joy. "Yes," she whispered. "I would love to." The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as workers bustled around Stonehaven Estate. Where portraits of stern-faced ancestors once hung, warm landscapes now brightened the halls. The heavy drapes that had kept the mansion in perpetual twilight were replaced with gauzy curtains that let sunlight pour through every window. Isabella stood in what used to be the formal dining room, now transformed into a communal gathering space. Her clipboard contained endless lists, furniture needed, programs to implement, staff to hire. But unlike the crushing weight of her old burdens, these responsibilities filled her with purpose. "The contractor says the East Wing renovations will be done by next week," Gabriel said, appearing beside her. He'd taken to wearing casual clothes these days, pressed jeans and cotton shirts that made him look more approachable, more human. "Perfect timing," Isabella replied, making a note. "We have 3 families waiting for placement." Gabriel watched her work, marveling at how naturally she'd stepped into her role as director. "You make it all look so easy." She laughed softly. "Nothing about this is easy, but it's right." She glanced around the room. "Sometimes I still can't believe you're really doing this, giving up your home." "It stopped being just a home the day you walked in," he said quietly. "You showed me it could be something more." Their eyes met, holding that gentle connection that had grown between them, deeper than attraction, steadier than passion. They'd learned to be comfortable in these moments, letting the silence speak what words couldn't yet express. The sound of Mrs. Porter's practical shoes clicking down the hallway broke their reverie. The housekeeper, who'd initially been skeptical about the foundation, had become one of their strongest supporters. "The reporter from the Boston Globe is here," she announced, somehow managing to make even this sound like a household chore that needed attending. Gabriel tensed slightly. Even after months of media attention, he still struggled with publicity. Isabella touched his arm lightly. "Remember, let me handle the difficult questions." The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Chen, met them in the library. Like the rest of the house, this room had been transformed. The dark wooden shelves now held books on healing, recovery, and empowerment alongside classics and children's stories. "Mr. Stone," Sarah began, "the media's calling Stonehaven Foundation the miracle on the coast. How do you respond to that?" Gabriel shifted in his chair, but his voice was steady. "It's not a miracle, at least not the kind they mean. The real miracle is in the women who come here, their courage to rebuild their lives. And what inspired this dramatic change? You were known for being quite reclusive." Isabella watched Gabriel's face soften as he answered. "It was her faith, not my money, that made this possible." He gestured to Isabella. "I just provided the building. She showed me its true purpose." The interview continued, with Isabella explaining their programs, job training, counseling, childcare, legal advocacy. She described how each woman who came through their doors helped shape the foundation's growth. "We learn from every story," she said. "Every survivor teaches us something new about strength." After the reporter left, Gabriel found Isabella in the piano room, now a music therapy space. She was arranging sheet music, humming softly. The sight still caught his breath sometimes. How naturally she belonged here, how completely she'd transformed his world. "You did wonderfully with the interview," she said without turning around. "I had a good teacher." He moved to help her organize the music stands. "You've taught me so much about grace under pressure." She smiled, remembering their early days when he could barely meet her eyes. "We've both learned a lot." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Women began arriving, some with children, some alone, all carrying invisible wounds that needed more than just shelter to heal. Isabella worked tirelessly, ensuring each person felt welcomed and safe. Gabriel focused on the practical aspects, securing additional funding, coordinating with legal services, upgrading security systems. But he also found himself drawn into the daily life of the foundation, sitting in on group sessions, helping. Children with homework, learning to listen without trying to fix everything. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, they sat together on the back porch. The sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen, where some of the residents were preparing dinner together. "Did you ever imagine this?" Isabella asked, gesturing to the transformed estate. "When you first hired me as your maid?" Gabriel shook his head, smiling. "I was too busy imagining all the ways you might disrupt my carefully ordered life." He paused. "I was right about that part, at least." She laughed, the sound mixing with the evening breeze. "And now? Now I understand that some disruptions are divine intervention in disguise." Their partnership had indeed grown into something neither of them had expected, a love built on shared purpose rather than passion, on mutual respect rather than romance. The media might call it a miracle, but they knew it was something more ordinary and yet more profound. Two people choosing to believe in redemption day after day. The Stonehaven Foundation quickly gained recognition for its comprehensive approach to healing. Other organizations began sending representatives to learn from their model. Isabella found herself speaking at conferences, sharing their vision of restoration through community. Gabrielle watched her grow into her leadership role with pride and amazement. The shy maid who had once trembled at his presence now commanded rooms full of professionals, her quiet strength touching countless lives. "You've created something extraordinary here," he told her one day as they reviewed plans for expanding their programs. She shook her head. "We created this together. Your courage to change made it possible." "My courage?" He raised an eyebrow. "I think you're confusing that with your stubborn refusal to let me remain a hermit." They shared a smile, remembering how far they'd come from those first awkward encounters in his kitchen. Their love had grown like the foundation itself, slowly, steadily, built on a foundation of trust and shared purpose. The media continued to follow their story, fascinated by the unlikely partnership between the former reclusive billionaire and his one-time maid. But what the cameras couldn't capture was the quiet moments. Gabriel teaching a young boy to play chess, Isabella counseling a woman through a crisis, the two of them working late into the night, planning and dreaming of ways to help more people. Their love story wasn't the kind that made headlines. It was written in the small gestures. The coffee Gabriel brought her during long meetings, the way Isabella instinctively knew when he needed space, their shared smiles across crowded rooms. It was a love born of purpose, strengthened by service, and sustained by faith. The Stonehaven Foundation became more than just a shelter. It became a symbol of transformation, proof that broken things could be made beautiful again. And at its heart were two people who had found each other through pain and emerged stronger, their love a testament to the power of compassion, trust, and unwavering faith. The morning light filtered through the newly restored stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wooden floors. Spring had transformed the Stonehaven estate, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. The gardens, once neglected, now bloomed with fresh life. Daffodils nodded their golden heads in the gentle breeze, and cherry blossoms dusted the paths with delicate pink petals. Isabella spent the morning helping two new residents settle into their rooms, her heart full as she watched them slowly relax into the safety of their new home. She hadn't noticed Gabriel's absence until mid-afternoon, when Mrs. Porter mentioned he had been working on a special project. As the sun began to set, Gabriel found her in the main hall. His eyes held a warmth she'd grown to cherish, though tonight there was something different in his expression, a mixture of nervousness and joy that made her curious. "Would you come with me?" he asked softly, extending his hand. "There's something I want to show you." He led her through the familiar corridors to his mother's piano room, the place where their hearts had first truly opened to each other. But when he pushed open the heavy wooden door, Isabella gasped. The room had been transformed, gone were the dusty sheets and heavy curtains. In their place, simple wooden pews lined either side of a central aisle. The afternoon light streamed through newly cleaned windows, and at the front, his mother's piano gleamed, restored to its former glory. A single candle flickered on its polished surface, casting a warm glow that danced across the walls. "It's beautiful," Isabella whispered, taking in the peaceful sanctuary he had created. Gabriel guided her forward, his hand gentle at the small of her back. As they reached the piano, she noticed a small velvet box placed carefully beside the candle. Her heart began to flutter. "You once said something that changed everything for me," Gabriel said, his voice soft but steady. "You told me that maybe God wasn't punishing me all those years ago, that he was saving my heart for the right kind of love." He turned to face her fully, his eyes shining with emotion. "Isabella, I believe with all my heart that he saved mine for you." With graceful movement that showed no trace of his former hesitation, Gabriel knelt before her. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes as he opened the velvet box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. Their eyes met in the candlelight, and in that moment all the pain of their past melted away. When she whispered, "Yes," her voice trembling with joy, Gabriel rose and drew her into his arms. The familiar notes of his mother's hymn seemed to float in the air around them as they embraced, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. The late summer sun painted the Stonehaven, gardens in shades of gold and amber. Roses climbed the restored trellises, their blooms nodding gently in the sea breeze. Children's laughter rang through the air as they chased butterflies across the freshly mowed lawn, while residents of the shelter gathered in small groups, their faces bright with hope and new beginnings. Isabella Stone stood beside her husband, her hand tucked into his. Her simple white dress caught the afternoon light, making her glow like an angel. Gabriel's eyes held none of their former shadows as he faced the assembled crowd. Board members, donors, residents, and local community leaders who had come to witness the official dedication of the Stonehaven Foundation. Mrs. Porter dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as Gabriel stepped forward to unveil the bronze plaque mounted on the garden wall. His voice, once so hesitant, now rang clear and strong across the gathering. "For my mother, who taught me restraint," he read, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. "For my wife, who taught me grace." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Isabella noticed the slight tremor in Gabriel's hand, not from fear this time, but from deep emotion. As the guests began to disperse toward the refreshment tables, she squeezed his fingers gently and slipped away. Her feet carried her to the chapel that had once been the piano room. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the keys in rainbow hues as she settled onto the bench. The familiar notes of the hymn rose beneath her fingers. The same melody that had once sent Gabriel fleeing in grief, now transformed into something healing and holy. She felt his presence before she heard his footsteps. Gabriel's arm slipped around her waist as he joined her on the bench, his body warm and solid beside her. The tension that had once made him rigid with fear had melted away, replaced by a peaceful strength. "Now I can control myself," he whispered, his lips close to her ear, "because I gave my heart to God before I gave it to you." Isabella's fingers never faltered on the keys as tears of joy slipped down her cheeks. Gabriel's hand covered hers, and together they let the music soar. The hymn floated out through the open windows, carried on the ocean breeze across the cliffs where they had both once known such loneliness. But now it was no longer a song of sorrow. It had become an anthem of healing, of faith rewarded, and of peace that would last forever. In that moment, as the last notes faded into the golden afternoon, both knew that their journey had never really been about control or restraint. It had always been about grace. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.